just finished quilting this beautiful batik quilt for a customer of mine, and I wanted to show you my technique for sewing the binding onto the quilt while it is still on the long arm frame. To sew the binding on at the long arm frame, I'm going to first need to install my template base because I'm going to be using a straight line template while I'm doing this. Although I could start anywhere around the quilt, since I'm already at the bottom, I'm going to start sewing the binding on at the bottom right hand corner, well, just above the right hand corner of the quilt. And then I'll be rolling the quilt onto the front roller as I work my way up the quilt. I have my binding strip with the two raw edges here at one end, and I'm going to find the middle of it right here, and then I'm going to place the middle of it just above the top left hand corner. It looks like I have a little diagonal seam right about where the middle of that is, which is good. So I'm going to lay that just above the left hand corner and position the binding laying on top of the quilt with the raw edges even with each other. And then I'm going to work my way back around to the bottom right hand corner where I'm going to start. Working my way along the bottom of the quilt with my raw edge of my binding along the raw edge of the quilt, and just making sure that I don't end up with another seam. It's right here. So we will start that with a seam just above that corner. So somewhere in this area right here, I'm going to start stitching my binding to the quilt top, stitch down and around in this direction, going clockwise around the quilt. I'm using my ruler with my hand placed flat, and I'll be stitching primarily from the beginning of my index finger to this thumb joint right here, and using my ruler as a guide to keep it straight, and stitching 1/4 of an inch seam so the edge of my foot is along the edge of the binding. Stopping, repositioning, and continuing the stitch. And when I get to the corner, I'm going to stop about 1/4 of an inch back from the corner and then do a diagonal right into the point. And then move my machine out of the way. I'm going to do the same mitered corner that I would if I were at my domestic machine. Fold it back, and with that nice little diagonal that I stitched, it's going to keep that right there, making a perfect miter for me. Once I fold it back down, I'm ready to stitch. I want to make sure that my fold here is even with the edge of the quilt top, and that this raw edge of the binding is again even with the edge of the quilt. Bringing the machine over so that the edges of the foot is along the edge of the quilt top, I'm ready again to start stitching along this edge of the quilt, maintaining my 1/4 inch seam as I stitch, and I'll continue stitching just like this until I get to the other end of the bottom of the quilt. Nearing the left edge of the bottom of the quilt, I'm going to keep my eye kind of on where that corner is. So that I can line up the left edge of my foot along the left edge of the quilt there, rotating the template so that I can stitch into the corner. And then I'm going to move the machine out of the way. and miter this corner. I'm going to pull it towards myself so that I have this nice diagonal fold right along that stitching line right there. Fold it away from me now so that the fold is along this bottom edge of the quilt and the cut edge of the binding is along the left side of the quilt top. As I stitch up the left side of the quilt, I'm going to be positioning my ruler on the right hand side of the needle so that it is on top of the binding strip and stitching like this. I can keep my eye along the left side of my hopping foot to make sure that it is stitching 1/4 inch away. Stop, reposition my hand, and move up the left hand side. I'm going to move up this side until I get to about here where I can't go any farther, and then I'm going to stop and roll the quilt a little bit down farther onto the front roller. Before I roll the quilt down onto the front roller, I wanted to show you just what a nice turn this is. Nicely mitered, even on the folded side and even over here. When it comes time to actually stitch this binding by hand onto the back side, that will turn very nicely. What I neglected to show you was that I actually left the needle down in the quilt while I rolled it onto the front roller. And from this point I'm going to continue stitching until I can't stitch any further again. I've reached the spot now that I would need to roll more of the quilt down onto the front roller, but I'm actually going to stop and pull up my bobbin thread here and move my machine to the other side of the quilt where I started stitching the binding on and work my way up that side at the same time. I brought my bobbin thread up to the top and I'm ready to start stitching on the right hand side of the quilt now, laying my binding strip out so that it's even with the edge of the quilt top, and again stitching 1/4 inch from the edge of the top of the quilt. I'll continue moving up this side of the quilt until I get to a spot up here that again I can't go any farther. And at this spot I'm going to stop, leave my needle down, roll some more of the quilt down onto the front roller, and then continue working my way up the right hand side of the quilt for the next short distance. As you can see, I'm gently moving the quilt forward. I don't want to damage the quilt, but I'll move it about as far as I can before I stop, and then I'll put my lock back onto the roller. Having smoothed out the edge of the quilt now and the binding on top of it, making sure the edges are even, I'm ready to stitch up this side a little farther. Having gone as far as I can on this side, I'm now going to pull up my bobbin thread, knot it off, and move my machine to the other side. Now I could have worked my way all the way around the quilt to the spot I wanted to finish, but because I started with half of my binding in the bottom left-hand corner, my ending point is going to be in the top right, just a little bit of the ways down on the right-hand side. So I'm kind of working my way up into that corner. Here we are, we can see the top of the quilt now. I've got a little bit more to go up to the top corner on the left-hand side, where I will again do the same procedure as I did before. I'll stitch to 1/4 inch from the edge, stitch off the corner, and then make my miter. I finished stitching up the left-hand side, diagonally off the corner, made my mitered corner, and now I'm ready to stitch across the top. Over here on the right-hand side of the quilt, you'll notice that I've stitched up to about about 16 inches from the edge of the top of the quilt. I'm going to leave this tail right here. I'm not going to stitch anymore up the right hand side of the quilt. I will stitch down to the corner here, make my miter, and start stitching down here a little ways, leaving about 10 to 12 inches in this section right here that I will finish not on the long arm but using my domestic machine. At the last corner at the top right hand side, again I stitched into the point of the corner. I fold it up away from me, pressing along that stitching line, bring it toward me, folding the edge, making it even with the top of the quilt top here, and again lining up the raw edge along the edge of the quilt, stitching over to 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the top, and stitching down just a little ways. That's about as far as I'm going to go. I have about 12 inches left. I'll do a couple of knotting stitches here just to make sure I hold it, and I'm basically done at the long arm. At this point I will take it off the frame and go to my domestic machine. What I will do before stitching there, I'm going to cut my tails. Now this is 2.5 inch binding. So I'm going to trim one of these kind of just a little bit past the middle spot here of these 12 inches. Let's say right there. And then bringing this one down, I'm going to cut it 2.5 inches longer. Whatever your binding width is, you're going to cut one strip that dimension longer than the other one, because this is 2.5 inches binding strip. Wherever I have cut this one off, I'm going to bring this one down and cut it. This is 2.5. I'm going to cut it 2.5 inches right here. I will make a diagonal seam along those cut edges, let it open back out, actually finger press that diagonal seam open, let it lay back out, and then using my domestic machine I will finish stitching from here down to here with 1/4 of an inch seam. And I have a perfectly mitered corner, or mitered seam here. Anybody looking at the quilt would not be able to know where this actually started and stopped as far as stitching this binding on.